I have often found for myself that when I am looking into certain spiritual practices or recommendations, that those practices or recommendations do not amount to what they claim to. In other words, when I try to validate them, I can't. Because for whatever reason, those teachings have a number of flaws to them. Maybe they require you to just take things on faith. There's a certain number of issues that come up, and I'm making this video to share some of my experiences in terms of what I found and what I look for when I consider a certain spiritual practice useful or not useful. The first thing to take away is that spiritual practices are pragmatic and they are first-person based. What this means is that the types of practices you do spiritually, they are from your own personal experience. This is contrary to science because science is third-person based in the sense that whatever you find in science, you can validate and replicate because it's outside of yourself. If you ask someone to share their own spiritual experiences or what they find from their own first-person practices, they are unable to give you a direct experience. However, they can describe what they've been through. You're the third-person perspective for their first-person experience, in other words. This is important to know because spiritual practices are difficult to validate or invalidate because you cannot directly experience what the other person has. Another unfortunate reality is that spirituality has become a pretty big business, and there are many frauds within spiritual practices. This is problematic because oftentimes people sell their products and they only promise things after you pay a certain amount of money or you follow them to a certain extent. Unfortunately, you can't validate many of these teachings until you pay a certain amount of money, and more often than not, these types of teachers are fraudulent. Now, not everybody who monetizes what they teach is fraudulent, however, the vast majority are. If something seems particularly lucrative, or if things are only promised after you hit a certain paywall, those are some pretty big red flags. There are also many people out there who know spiritual practices, but have not realized what they are talking about. These are the people who have intellectualized a lot of different teachings, however, they haven't gone through the actual practices themselves, so they haven't realized from their own first-person experience what they're talking about. This is kind of like the difference between somebody who understands things through reading books versus somebody who understands things through going through the actual practices from their own experience. This is problematic because you can look through 1,000 textbooks and memorize every single one of them, but you still will not have taken away the core essence of what is being taught because that has to be realized from your own direct practice. When you see certain people who are very didactic or very attached to the content of what they are teaching, as opposed to the context of what they are teaching, that to me is often a red flag. Another problem that I often have run into is that spiritual teachings are given in a very hierarchical manner. What I mean by this is that many spiritual practices hold certain people above others, like spiritual teachers, past figures, current figures, and they will always say things like you can never amount to this teacher, but you can always aspire to be like them. Those kinds of teachings I find problematic because it's an indicator to me that the people who are talking about other people in a hierarchical manner have not fully realized what they're teaching. Because after a certain level of spiritual realization, you see that there is a thread. Thread is not really the right word to use, but I'll just use it in this case. There's a common thread that is shared by all things, and it doesn't hold a hierarchy between anyone. When you realize this thread for yourself through correct knowledge and correct practice, this view of duality, this view of self, other, higher, lower, those things dissolve. And you can see all things from this common thread that is shared between all things and everyone. And in this sense, all things are equal. They just appear different. And if you can't see past the appearance, then you're going to believe in that appearance. This point is pretty big because coming from a religious family myself, there are a lot of spiritual practices out there, unfortunately, that hold certain punishments if you don't directly follow what they teach. Any number of punishments could show up. It might be something like a promise to go to hell, or eternal damnation, or permanent reincarnation, rebirth. When you take these things at a very literal level, they lead to problems because you start to take things on faith as opposed to practice because you're scared of what the outcomes might be if you don't directly follow those teachings. One thing that was a realization for me, no matter what spiritual practice or religious faith you buy into, there will be another one that will still promise you eternal damnation for not following that specific spirituality or religion. So no matter what you do, you are screwed in terms of buying into a certain religion or spiritual practice or not buying into a certain religion or spiritual practice. And most important for myself, in terms of following certain practices or buying into certain practices, is whether or not it works. If you take the spiritual guidelines or whatever the teaching is and you put it into practice yourself and you truly follow through and you realize what is being taught to the end and you can validate what is being said, then that spiritual teaching or whoever that spiritual teacher was, they are probably legitimate. Now, it's not easy to validate and go through the practices, but you can do it yourself. You just have to put in the right effort. The content that I'm giving in this channel, everything I have validated myself, so I know it works, and I'm not asking for any money. I'm not asking for anything in return. That there are others out there who are willing to try and practice these things and realize what is being taught leads to psychological freedom in the sense that you don't have to suffer in this existence, in this life. That's the main thing I want to get across. So the bottom line here is that you shouldn't take things at face value. You shouldn't take things on blind faith. You shouldn't take things because somebody else said so. You should only take things when you have put them into full practice for yourself and realized for yourself that what is being taught or what is being stated is true and valid to the best of your own knowledge and experience. When you take things from that perspective, it's pretty hard to go wrong, but you have to put the work in to validate and fully understand what is being taught and what you're capable of experiencing.